All right, we're almost there. And you've been a very patient audience. I'm going to sum up and just run over everything, and then we're going to finish off with that visual depth video. Or a reaction to it. So there's 5 patterns to improve robustness. These are patterns I use all the time. Make sure your code, you're not having to check return types all the time, and use exceptions when a return type's not the right thing to do. Check your inputs. Check state. Make sure that you're failing because you've detected a problem rather than PHP's given up and gone, what the hell are you doing? Be in charge. Don't rely on try-catch blocks everywhere all the time because we don't do it. Nobody does everything 100% of the time. Support failure handlers. Inject that policy into libraries that at least you control. When things go wrong, don't leave a mess behind. Tidy up. Fix your database, fix your file system, fix your session, whatever you've got to fix. Make sure it's fixed. And above all else, know you've got a problem. Don't happily carry on not knowing you've got systems crashing and that there's problems that need to be fixed. Make sure you do that. And use them all, please. In my experience, they're all interlinked, and the benefits of having all 5 help you ship code that just works. Other than the fact you may have coded your algorithms wrong and you've got correctness bugs, but that's what your unit testing should be sorting out anyway. That's a different topic. So those are the 5 patterns to improve robustness. What do you think? Have I convinced anybody that this is worth going down? Definitely. Any skeptics? Nope. That was too easy. I don't believe you. Has anyone got anything radically different to this approach? Now that I've explained it, has anyone seen this approach or something like it in their own work quite a bit and seen benefits or problems it causes?
I sort of do bits of that, like I didn't have an overall plan.
Yeah.
Sometimes I better throw an exception here because this could be quite bad, but I'm not really catching that exception. I know they're all the way up to the sort of main error handler. So
yeah.
I'm kind of sometimes thinking, this shouldn't ever fail.
Yeah.
And there's that like logic exception that you can throw that kind of means the logic's going wrong. Sounds like if the status is this, else if the status is that, else
yeah.
throw logic exception. It should never get there because I know that there's nothing in the system can set at one that isn't that.
Yes.
So that was a kind of question I had, is like, is it okay to start throwing logic exceptions in bits in your code?
So I'm not a big fan of throwing exceptions found in the SPL library. It's not a slight against the SPL library at all. It's been very handy to move PHP forward. But the problem is, what you see is runtime exception is the classic one people throw. Or you see people throw, it's either invalid or illegal argument exception. I can't remember which one of the two it is. There's only one of them in SPL, and I always get it confused. And what happens is those are too generic. And when they appear in the logs, you go, oh, I've got a logic exception. What logic exception? The thing I want to know is, have I got a missing customer? Have I got, I'm trying to think what else. Has my database gone away, for example? Runtime error can often hide a lot of those type of things. The reason I don't like those generic exceptions is, in the old days, we used to write an ops manual, where before we had exceptions, we returned errors as integers. Anyone who's done any low-level Linux programming will have seen integers, error values come out, and they're negative integers if memory serves. It's been a long time, so I could be wrong. And we used to write manuals. We used to write tables where we said, if you see this code, this is what's happened. This is your manual recovery procedure. That's what we used to do in the old days. And so we used to have a code for everything that went wrong. And if we had a new failure, a new way a system could fail, we would add and update the ops manual as we went on the project. That's what we were taught to do in the pre-web days, and before we had these language tools available. IFAL, which is well known for popularizing exceptions, I believe, was around in the 80s, but no one used it commercially at all. Very barely anyone used it in academia. But today, the world has changed. You've got all that. But if you were writing an ops manual for your sysadmins, if you don't have to do that work yourself, the person who's on call at 3 a.m., if they see logic error in the logs, what are they going to do?
You give it a wee message as well.
You give it a wee message, yes. But wouldn't it be nicer to say which have a unique message so you can give them unique recovery procedures?
Yeah.
Or even to tell them, don't phone me at 3 a.m, this can wait till 9 a.m. Could be in your interest as well as your customers, you see.
Yeah.
It gives you more flexibility. The other problem is if you're throwing logic exceptions or runtime exceptions, somewhere someone may well have put a big try-catch block saying, catch all logic exceptions, catch all runtime exceptions. And you don't know whether their recovery code in there is handling the circumstances when you threw that exception. Chances are it's not, it's just crapping out and logging to disk, but you're taking a risk at that point. Yes, please.
Yeah, I agree with you because they are very limited.
Yeah.
By using them, you're only using them because you're assuming everyone else is rubbish and just using the native exception.
Yes.
So you're only being slightly better than they are, and you're not actually being very good at all.
Yeah.
I'm really attracted by the idea of this failure callback thing.
Yep.
Because in my mind, does this actually allow your code to better fulfill the single responsibility principle in that it gets rid of another bit of responsibility that it would potentially have?
I'd not thought about it that way, but I can see how the argument could be made. Normally people think about single responsibility about a class not having two completely unrelated things that it's responsible for, and it's used to control classes growing out of control. So injecting failure into a class is a way of shrinking it down. So I like that argument.
I mean, could that be passed at constructor time as opposed to when a method?
I would pass it into a constructor if the constructor failed, but I wouldn't pass it into a constructor if a method later on could fail, because failure is a context, it's a situation, and that method could fail in different contexts, and I may need different recovery at that point. So that's why I haven't in the past thought about passing it into a constructor. But it's not something I've played with. So I would say go away and play with it and let us all know.
Because I would see that as a way of making it least disruptive. Because otherwise you've got to add to every method signature. Whereas if it was in the constructor, it wouldn't affect method signatures.
So a different way you could do that is, for me, my own experience with writing failure handles, sorry, I'll get to you in a moment, apologies, is it can be a bit of a ball ache writing all of these failure handlers, especially because PHP doesn't support types for functions. All it sees is callable. You can't say what the callable's inputs, outputs are. It's not very good at that. Somewhere the language really needs to evolve. Now we're going for anonymous everything these days with invoke and things like that, if anyone uses that. But if you were to make a library of prepackaged error handlers, for example, let's say you analyze your code and you know there's only 12 or 14 situations where an error could happen and you need, and there's only 14 recovery steps you needed to do. You could prepackage those as classes, and then you could create that object and pass that in ready. So you're not having to rewrite these functions everywhere all the time. That's something I've been thinking about doing this week. I haven't done it yet, so I don't know whether it's a bad idea or not. But that's one way you can reduce it. So it doesn't reduce the disruption of your signatures, but at least it means what you're passing in is less effort. Don't know if that answers. But with passing it into a constructor, have a go, have a play with it, and let us all know. Tell us, because if it's a better technique, I want to learn it. I'm still learning. If you've got a better idea, try it out. Come back and say, this is why it works, and this is the problems I've had with it. Let us all know. That'd be awesome. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm a bit more sceptical, I guess, about this passing thing in.
Okay. Nothing wrong with that.
Specifically, to build on a previous point as well, so you were saying there about 12 and 14, so not different ways it could fail. It's not get into a situation where you're having to pass a lot of different kind of callables back in. And especially build on previous points about being very specific about your exceptions. You don't just want to pass in one callable, you might want to pass in like 2 parameters and 14 different callables to one function.
Okay, so unfortunately I don't have that production code on this laptop. This is my presentation laptop. But if I had that production code, what I'd be able to show you was the line before I make that call, I write the error handler, write the line above. So if you look at the, I guess you call them controllers, they're actions in Zen. I tend to use Zen Expressive rather than any of the other frameworks. It's roughly analogous to a controller. And you'll see there's an error handler, library call, error handler, library call. And the error handler changes right before, but it also means right before the library you can see what I'm going to do if I fail. So it makes code reviews quite easy, but it is a lot of work.
How do you handle API changes to that? Because if you've released a library and you think, oh, it's like 10 ways this could fail, so you've got 10 callables, and then suddenly after a bit you realise actually there's another 2 ways it could fail. I've got 12 callables. So
A library receives the call. It receives the callable. So the application's passing the handler into my library. If I release a library, all I'm doing is I'd be changing when I detect a failure. I wouldn't be changing what I do because the application's telling me. The library never ever decides.
So those callers don't take parameters then inside?
They can do. What I do is I tend to pass in the same parameters to the method that was called. So but they're there mostly to help with recovery and to generate log messages. That's what I do. I tend to keep the method signatures the same so that it's less effort on my brain.
Yeah.
I suppose you're hoping that the library function that you're calling is quite small and will only fail in one set of circumstances. You know, if it's some really long bit of code that goes off and does lots of multiple things, you don't know at which point it's failed. You just passed in your hand.
Now that is a very good point. I'm very lucky that I don't have to reuse a lot of third-party code for the kind of work I do. So I'm able to create libraries where they are small and the amount of ways they can fail is small and limited, which means the error handlers that we pass in, these failure handlers, aren't dealing with a lot of different circumstances. I've not had that situation that you're talking about where anything could have happened underneath and there's quite a wide variety. So I've not got practical experience with this yet. My belief, and we'll find out one day either way, is it doesn't matter because what's happening is the application knows the state of the system before you do the first library call. So it doesn't matter what it's calling, etc. The application knows the context, and it's the application providing the failure handler. So the application knows what needs to be checked to clean up afterwards if there's an error. Because the application isn't working out whether there's a failure or not. The application doesn't care. The application is saying what to do if a failure has happened. So the application knows if you're inside a database transaction. It knows if you've been talking to a remote API. It knows, or it should know, whether you've written to the PHP session and whether that needs repairing. It knows if there's anything in your output buffer, for example. And so my belief, and I have no practical experience to prove this, but my belief is it won't matter in practice. But you never know, I might be up here 6 months' time saying 4 patterns, or 5 patterns and a huge bear pit or something. Who knows? I haven't got hands-on experience, but I'm predicting it won't matter because what matters is the state of the application. And the application always knows what's supposed to be going on. Whether you've accounted for all those properly is a different issue. But at least the application should know because the error handler is context sensitive. But we'll find out. Yes?
I don't know exactly how to say it, but
Go on, this should be fun.
is anyone else doing that?
Anyone else doing what?
Like number 3, the one that everyone's interested in.
Yes.
Like I'm living in a bit of a bubble. I don't get a lot of contact with like the outside PHP world. This could be like a whole new thing that everyone's going to start.
So I lifted this from functional programming. I am not a functional programmer. My generation was faced with functional languages that were hopelessly impractical in practice. They were so slow they were unusable. Because I don't know how many of you know, functional programming languages came first. They're older than the languages we use. They're older than the programming types we use, the programming paradigms we use. Functional languages came first. Lisp goes back to the 50s. PHP, C, they're developed from Algol 68. I don't know when Algol 68 was first formed as an idea. 68 was probably when it was standardized rather than when it was first released. Who knows? I'm not that old. Old enough to program COBOL, but I don't admit that in public. But Lisp, etc. came first, but in those days the languages were too slow. You couldn't write a practical system in them. CPUs have changed. You've got all these caches now, which means the way functional programs work and compilers have improved. I believe Haskell code can run quite well in fact, I do believe it can match C in some circumstances these days, but I'm not a functional programmer. But that's where I lifted it from. In functional programming, they talk about eliminating if statements, and they also talk about pure functions, where there's no state held in the function at all. Everything's on its inputs and outputs. And if you read into that, you should see people using this technique. And hopefully they're using it better than me. And then you can come and tell us all about it. But no, seriously. At the end of the day, there's nothing special about me up here talking about this other than the fact I'm doing it and you're not. That's the only difference. I've been doing it a long time, and yes, I've got a camera and all the rest of it, so it looks impressive, maybe. But all I'm doing is talking about what I've seen and what I've done. You will all have your own experiences, and some of those will definitely go into areas I've never seen and may never see. Just come and share it with everybody. Okay. Any more questions before we get on to that video to finish? Yes? Nope?
I was stuck. I just have it in my head that someone over here had a really good question, and it was going to be in the slides, and I can't. You asked about, it was one of you two had a question about passing the objects, right? There's the value object, and someone said if you're passing it all the way along and
Yes.
validating inputs at all the different
Oh,
layers.
is it weird, you know, like,
Yeah, because at the moment you're actually validating in every function.
Yes, I am.
Whereas I'd be validating one.
Yes. My apologies.
Once it's validated,
Yes.
can't be passed to the next one without.
So my apologies. I thought we'd discuss that.
Yeah.
I don't have a slide on that technique, as I hopefully explained.
But the principle is do it everywhere.
Yeah, do
Is
it.
that-
Yeah. If you're happy with that system, if it works for you, do it. Some robustness is more important than no robustness. And a lot of these things are philosophical ideas. They're not a black and white thing. They're not a right or wrong. Some systems ship with no robustness. They're perfectly happy. A good example for this are microsites for advertising campaigns. They're meant to last 6 months. That's it. Until, because at that point, no one's interested in the marketing campaign anymore. So they're meant to be disposable. So you're not going to invest a lot in code in that. You're going to invest a lot in design and user experience. But you're going to have it really slimmed down on features and functionality. You're not going to put a huge amount of robustness in, because you're not going to get the return on the investment, for example. So use techniques that work for you. I use these techniques because it allows me to write the fastest possible PHP code that I know. And I work on the kind of systems where that performance unfortunately matters. That's why I rarely use a framework, because they're too slow. They're way too slow for the kind of things I tend to get hired to do. But those are my problems, they're not necessarily yours. So, any more questions? No. Yes, please.
So you started with, you talked about this happy path
Yes.
in the code, and then you talk about all these things. So I just wondered that in the end, if I did all this stuff here,
Yeah.
would it still be like a happy path for me? Because even that I catch all those exceptions and stuff,
Yeah.
it's still gonna be happy path because that's all I could do, and I think it's good, right? So
Not quite. So happy path is when you're only testing with values that are supposed to work. That's happy path. And hopefully you've got unit tests where your testing is repeatable. You can run the same test day after day after day, and they continue to work, and they show you that you haven't broken your code, and they show you that new code works. But if all you're doing is putting in inputs that are supposed to work, that's happy path. This is about dealing with inputs that aren't supposed to work. It's about making sure you've got code to handle that, and then you'd add unit tests in there to actually throw these inputs at your code so that you're proving that the robustness code in there works. So with unit tests, anything that's supposed to accept an integer, for example, you throw a string at it, a float, an array, null, true, false. You'd throw a lot of them in. How many of you use PHP unit and data providers? A few people. Okay. PHP unit allows you to run the same test and have input parameters, and they're called data providers. Go look it up and look at how those work, because what you do is you create an array of possible inputs, and it runs the same test, and it steps through the array one at a time and throws them at your code. It's fantastic. You'll see some of my open source libraries sometimes have 2,000-3,000 tests, and most of that is because I've got 2,000-3,000 data sets that I'm throwing at the code. It's not 2,000 or 3,000 individual tests. It could be a couple of hundred tests, each one's taking 10 or 50 or 100 inputs depending on what I'm testing for example. And you can easily get a lot of code with that. Come to Glasgow. I'm going to be talking about that in Glasgow. If Glasgow's not a dirty word in Edinburgh. I'm from the south, so I'm not familiar with these things. Pleads ignorance and runs for the door. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but I have like another one.
Okay, awesome. It's far better than everyone going, oh, is there more pizza arrived?
Yeah, so
Please.
I just was wondering, like, the whole time that when you work,
Yes.
do you like involve like other developers in the things you did? I mean, like things like code review.
Yes.
Because sometimes when I like build something, I just think, okay, this is the best I can do, but still, this guy probably better if he checks it because I think this could break. Do you,
Absolutely.
like, do this stuff and what
Yes.
do you think about this?
Yes. If I'm working in a team, code reviews are mandatory, except in emergencies. I should do a talk about dealing with emergencies someday. But in normal operations, code reviews are mandatory. I didn't video it, although maybe I did a talk about code reviews at PHP Cambridgeshire. I can't remember if they videoed it or not. I didn't video it, but the slides are definitely online. So you can go there and you can see how I do code reviews and why I do them. The slides are online. And if I get your details afterwards, I will happily send those slides to you if you want.
Okay.
And hopefully the answer you're looking for is in there. And if not, it's worth me knowing, because obviously that's a new thing for me to learn from.
Okay, so you kind of like value the fact that the team like is involved together, like
Absolutely.
single person's code.
I have worked with some people who are definitely brilliant. I have never met any developer whose work couldn't be improved by a second pair of eyes, a second brain adding input. I've never met that situation. I've worked with some world-class people, and even with them, a second person can look at something and make it better. Because sometimes it's easier to polish than to fill a blank page. Filling a blank page is hard. It's very hard. But taking someone else's thing and spotting all the things that need sorting, a lot of humans are very good at that. And not just for the sake of it and nitpicking and all the rest of it. It's, so I would always say 2 people should look at code before it's committed for release, before you merge your branch if you're using Git, for example. I would always say that. An emergency situation where time is of the essence, where you've got minutes to react rather than hours or days, that's the only time I would say skip code reviews, depending on who's writing the code. If the poor soul on 3 a.m. is a junior developer or someone who's only been with you a month or so, you really want someone else checking their code, because that poor sod may not know what they've let themselves in for. And you really want to help and support them at that point. So context again is key. Okay. Yes, please.
I can't remember the name of it, but there's a library that looks over your code and then sends illegal values to all of your methods.
Yes, there is. I believe it's called Hamcrest.
Is that what it's called? I thought it was a Java one.
There will be many of these,
Right, okay.
but PHP has one called
Sort of
Hamcrest.
Spoof or something like that.
I don't know. I don't regularly write Java code anymore,
Right,
but PHP has one called Hamcrest.
right, okay.
Give it a go. Let us know how you get on with it. I don't use it myself. I've had mixed experience with it, but you may find it's moved on since the last time I looked at it, and you may find it's more mature. There are other code quality checker tools out there. Scrutinizer, especially if you write open source code. Scrutinizer is a hosted service. Highly recommend it. All of my code goes through Scrutinizer. If you go through my Git logs on GitHub, you'll see commit messages saying fixing bugs found by Scrutinizer or fixing issues found by Scrutinizer. You'll see that. So because it's an online service, I don't run it when I run my unit tests. I batch my work up and submit it when I push up to GitHub, which may be 10, 20, 30 commits at a time, depending on what I'm doing. But there are tools out there. I think it's called Exacat. There's another one being done out, I believe, somewhere in Europe. So I want to say Eastern Europe, but it may be Belgium, so I could be wrong. I've not looked at that since it launched, so I don't know what state it's in. When it launched, it was a soft launch, a marketing launch, if you like. There wasn't much substance behind it. So static analysis tools are hard with PHP. PHP's language definition is a mess, and that's the polite version. If you open the language parser, the actual Lexer itself, and start playing with it, I've done this because I actually added native JSON support to the PHP syntax, which I still need to actually convince everyone else to ship in PHP 7 point something, or tell me it's a bad idea. I got fed up copying JSON in tests. I get fed up copying JSON, which I'm submitting at APIs, and I'm to turn it to PHP syntax or to send it back out because I want to build it as objects first so I can manipulate values. I don't just want it as a string. But if you open those parsers and play with it, the things that are legal in there are just horrendous. Look at Nicket's parser. He's got a PHP parser written in pure PHP. Try and make sense of it. Try and make sense of its output. That's also challenging. There's so many things that you can express in PHP. It makes static analysis really difficult and really expensive. That's why GitHub's full of static analyzers that have been started and not finished. I've lost count of how many there are. Unfortunately, Scrutinizer's never been open sourced, which is a shame because it seems to be the best that I've used. But there are tools out there. Any more questions? Yes, please.
So I think that after everyone here, after learning all this stuff,
Yeah.
we might say that tomorrow everyone is gonna go back to work and start throwing and catching all the exceptions everywhere, right?
Okay.
So, if
That
you
never
say-
happens. It'd be awesome if it did.
Yeah, but what will you say would be a good starting point for us?
If
to
I would
work?
start with the first pattern. I'd start at the top. Change how you design your APIs. I mean, a lot of people go straight here about doing input checking because you don't have to change your APIs. But what the problem is, though, is all you're doing is moving a problem. You're not actually solving it. If you start so the next time you write a function, think about its return values, first of all. Make sure the return values are only data rather than a success or fail thing. Eliminate that from your designs, because then you've removed a problem rather than simply transported a problem. You haven't shifted it from one place to another. So that's why I would start there. That's why they're in this order. Or you could start at the bottom and add logging and make sure your logging's good. So at least you know everything's horrible. Or you know everything's wonderful. Yeah, you may have a good system. It's perfectly possible. Don't rule it out. So start at one end or the other and then work through. It would be my advice. But you don't have to do number one everywhere and then number two. Do number one in a new piece of code, then improve that same piece of code by adding number two. Then improve that same piece of code by adding number three. So do all these changes in a small space, so you're not creating a huge headache for everyone else around you. It's all small, and therefore they know if they call your library, it's going to behave differently, rather than not knowing what's going to be different where. It helps people get their heads around it if you introduce change gradually. I hope that helps.
Yeah.
And if anyone does actually change their behaviors, and do let me know, because I'm used to coming up and doing talks, and everyone's happy, which is awesome. And then in a week's time, nothing has changed. If this resonates with you, if you can see benefits to this, if you can see how it's going to solve things that waste your time today, please adopt them. Or find your own thing to adopt at least, even if you don't adopt these. Don't carry on as you are. Definition of madness is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result if memory serves. So don't go mad. Or if you are mad, try to see if this gives you some sanity. And if it doesn't, if this causes you problems, do let me know so I can learn from your experience as well. I'd rather learn from a positive experience, but if you have a negative one, that helps as well. Okay? Any more questions?